Welcome back, everybody. We are going to be talking about firewalls today with FreeBSD. So I'm going to be the first one to admit I really like UFW. So if you've ever used Ubuntu or Manjaro or any of those systems and you needed to set up a firewall, I have found that UFW was a fantastic tool. Super easy, simplifies everything. It is deceptively powerful and it can accomplish quite a bit of things that you wouldn't think that it would be able to accomplish, including integration with things like fail to ban. So you could set up UFW and then you could integrate fail to ban, and then if somebody tries to connect to your server 3 times and they do it incorrectly, provide the wrong password, whatever, then you can just block their IP. There's a ton of really cool things that you can do with UFW. However, we're using FreeBSD. And so the first thing that you're going to need to do is just make sure that you are logged in and that you are currently connected to FreeBSD. I also recommend, if you have not done so, uh, go in there and create yourself another snapshot. Okay? Get your snapshot done, then come back. And you can pause the video right now, do the snapshot, come back. And the reason why I say this is before you get started, having that snapshot helps you, because if you were to do this on a system that's remote and was not local to you, you could potentially lock yourself out of that system. All right. Now, with everything that we're going to do today, we're going to do a lot of copying and pasting, so this shouldn't be a big deal. It should actually go very quickly just because I've already provided the commands. But if you were one of those people who was going to do this and type it all out by hand or anything like that, then just be very cautious, because if you do this wrong, again, you could potentially lock yourself out of the machine via SSH, and then you're going to have to go back in and you're going to have to actually use some kind of terminal emulator or something else, like VirtBox, wherever you open the box itself. You'd have to start using that again, which we don't want to do. So, what is a firewall? A firewall is a tool that monitors traffic in and out of a computer or a network or otherwise, and when it sees specific traffic, it can take an action. Now, there's two schools of thought. You're going to hear of a allow list or a deny list. You're going to hear it referred to as a whitelist or a blacklist, or you're going to hear it referred to as the American method or the Soviet method. So typically, you're going to hear me refer to it as the American method or the Soviet method because that's what I was trained on. And the way that it goes is on the American method, everything is allowed except for that which is forbidden. And on the Soviet side, everything is forbidden except for that which is allowed. So if we set up our firewall correctly, we could say block everything, block all traffic except for incoming SSH traffic. And what that does is it prevents any traffic over the network from being able to reach the system unless it's coming in over SSH. You could do this with port 80 or 443 if you were running a web browser. So what's the benefit of this? The benefit is if you set up your firewall correctly, it becomes the first line of defense against somebody who is trying to penetrate or otherwise break into that system. And the reason why this functions is when you set up your firewall, theoretically, you should know what is running on the box. So if you know that your machine uses port 22 to allow SSH and SFTP traffic, then you should block all other traffic. Why? Because there is no reason for somebody to even attempt to connect to your machine over port 443 if you know that that machine itself never runs a web server. So if there's no web server on that system, then there should be no reason to even allow somebody to probe for that web server. And in addition to that, you should be paying attention to your network, even internal. So even if you're on a NATed network, if you have a NAT, network address translation set up, so AKA if you're one of the people who are using this video from a CenturyLink or a Cox or a Roadrunner or whatever connection that you have at home, it is highly likely that you are probably on a connection that is using NAT, and that means that internal to your network, nobody should be trying to connect to anything on your system except for that which you allow people to connect. worked on. Which means, in addition to that, if you ever see traffic on your network that appears to be either inappropriate or potentially as though somebody were probing for open ports, then that starts telling you that you might have an intruder, right? Most home networks are not going to end up having an intruder. You're going to be on a NAT. Your system's not going to allow connections from the outside world. But if you're watching this video, it is highly likely that you are one of those power users who might do something like port forwarding, aka you set up your server so that somebody could connect to it over port 22. And then you could use something like duck DNS in order to funnel traffic. So the question that I get asked often that needs to be answered here is, if I am behind a NAT, should my system still run a firewall? And the answer is absolutely yes. Even behind a NAT, you should be running a firewall on each individual system in order to make sure that the only connectivity and traffic going in and out of every box on your network is sanctioned and approved traffic. And part of this is, in the event that you ever do suffer a breach, then you are going to make it much, much more difficult for individuals who have gained access to your network to be able to exploit the resources that they now have access to. So with that said, setting up the FreeBSD firewall is not incredibly difficult, but it is a little bit more involved than, say, Ubuntu, where we could do something like sudo ufw allow SSH, sudo ufw start, sudo ufw enable, right? So we have 3 commands and we're done. With a system like FreeBSD, it's going to take a little bit more than that. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to type sudo sysrc, and what this does is it is a method by which you can edit the rc config file in a more sane and safer manner. Because of course, and I'm just going to do this for the sake of showing you, we could do something like sudo nvim etc rc dot conf, and we could start adding the variables that we need. We could just start putting them in here. We don't want to do that though. So what we want to do is we want to type sudo sysrc firewall underscore enable equals yes. And you can now see it says firewall enabled goes from no to yes. We're going to set quiet to yes. And the reason why we're setting quiet to yes is because the firewall that is used by FreeBSD that we are configuring actually behaves differently whenever quiet is enabled. If you didn't enable quiet, what ends up happening is, as traffic hits your system and you're plugged in directly to the terminal here, you would actually see warnings and information popping up over and over and over, and it would interrupt you, and there'd be all kinds of issues that you would suffer because it's quiet is not enabled. So what we want to do is just right off the bat, we want to enable quiet. So hit yes, and you'll see firewall quiet, no to yes. The next one that we're going to do is sudo sysrc firewall underscore type equals, and we're going to choose workstation. Obviously, if this was a server, we could change to server, or if it was a different type of system, there are other types of systems that we could use, but we have changed it from unknown to workstation. The next thing that we're going to do is, I'm going to do this as a copy and paste just to make my life easier. And we have put SSH here. We could, in theory, put a space and put in something like HTTPS, and that would allow port 443 traffic. We could go HTTP, and so on and so forth. The reason why we are doing SSH is, at this time, this box only needs SSH enabled. But there may be a time where we're going to come back and we're going to set up HTTP and HTTPS on this system. So therefore, we want to do SSH for now. And then later on, if we come back, we'll actually edit this in order to allow additional traffic. So we're going to hit enter. The next thing that we're going to do is, it's going to ask, do we allow services? And we're going to choose any. And then, do we want to log the denies? And we absolutely do. Remember, If you have the space, you want to log the information for as long as possible for the sake of having records. And then in addition to that, for audit purposes. And then in addition to that, there are other tools that we can use, things like Suricata or Snort or a whole host of other items that can actually go in and take these logs and then parse them. And then if we have that information, the denies that have happened, we can start using that in order to create a more offensively designed security that would automatically go out and look for traffic that seems odd. Or another popular thing that people like to do on their network is they'll take a Windows computer and they'll purposely set it up so it appears to be kind of vulnerable, and then they leave it on the network and don't advertise it anywhere. Just don't let anybody know that it's there, but they have the system set up. And the first time that somebody goes to it and they log into it, that sets off an alert within the network that tells all the security people that there is potentially a problem because somebody has scanned for, discovered, and then otherwise attempted a connection to a system that everybody knows that they should not be touching. Uh, that kind of behavior, I think folks don't talk about it enough, but it's important for you to know when you connect to a network, if you do a scan, you're potentially setting off alarm bells somewhere. Somebody is being informed that yes, this computer over here that should never ever ever receive any traffic, well, we just saw active scan traffic on that computer. That tells us somebody's potentially inside the network. So something to keep in mind, right? So sudo sysrc firewall log deny equals yes. Yeah, absolutely want those logs. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to grep for the word firewall, and we're going to do that in rc.conf. And now we can see firewall enable equals yes, firewall quiet equals yes, firewall type equals workstation, firewall my services equals SSH, firewall allow services equals any, and then firewall log deny equals yes. And so now sudo service ipfw start. And it says consider using SSH TCP in firewall my services. You know what? That's probably a good idea. So let's go back up here and switch to /TCP. And now if we actually grep, we'll see SSH TCP is in there. So all it was an overwrite. So I am going to restart the firewall rules. And now at this point, ipfw is running, and check that with status. So you can go to sudo service ipfw status, and we see ipfw is now enabled. And that means all incoming traffic to this machine is now blocked unless that traffic is SSH traffic. And that is the start of securing your system using a firewall. Doesn't take a lot of time, and if you already have the commands available to you, it's quite easy to set up. So what I recommend doing is, if you've worked on this with me, if you followed along, take these commands that we have put in here and save them, put them somewhere. One of the things that I do is we have a wiki that I share with a handful of other people, and if you want to make changes to that wiki, then if you have the permission to do so, you can go in there and you can add stuff, but we keep the data that we might want for later so that at any time we can go back and we can very quickly set this stuff up. Another thing that you might want to think about doing is you could use a tool like Ansible. And so you could actually set up an Ansible playbook that would automatically set up a firewall for a system that you were configuring. So right now, for the purposes of this, right, we did everything by hand. But in the future, you may want to do some search engine exploring. Look for tools like Ansible. And I'll talk about Ansible undoubtedly in another video later, but you could set up everything that we did as part of an Ansible playbook, run a single command, it would set everything up for you, and then you have a running firewall, and all you need to remember how to do is edit your my services variable so that you could change that to whatever it is that you need to allow. So with that said, thanks for joining me. This one is incredibly quick. Should only have taken about 15 minutes for us to get through this entire thing, and that's with me explaining. So if you go back and you decide to do this yourself, you should be able to knock this thing out in absolutely time. So thank you again for joining me.